Hi guys, welcome back. Now, as we proceed with our course further, we are starting with a very important topic, that is the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. And this model will explain us various fundamental concepts because the ADAS model is actually very important in terms of understanding the whole macroeconomics and how the macroeconomy, in fact, how the aggregate economy functions. And the ADS model, or the concept of aggregate demand and aggregate supply, is you can say it's a fundamental framework in macroeconomics that is used to explain about the level of prices in the economy, the output levels in the economy, and it explains and it captures the various economic fluctuations, and it models those economic fluctuations that happens across the wider economy. यहाँ मैंने एक वाइडर इकोनॉमी का वर्ड यूज़ किया, नया वर्ड यूज़ किया है, पर्पसली यूज़ किया है बिकॉज आई वांटेड टू एम्फसाइज समथिंग. सो आई मीन यू हैव टू अंडरस्टैंड दैट एग्रीगेट डिमांड और एग्रीगेट सप्लाई का जो मॉडल हम पढ़ेंगे, जो कॉन्सेप्ट्स पढ़ेंगे ADAS के, this will basically help, you'll actually understand how we use the AD and AS model to show a macroeconomic equilibrium in an economy, and how aggregate demand and aggregate supply responds to various economic shocks, right? To various macroeconomic shocks across the economy, and what subsequently happens to your real GDP output levels, and what subsequently happens to your price levels as well. So this is what we're talking about, the aggregate economy. Now, before we start, I want to introduce the concept of aggregate economy. देखें, हमने एग्रीगेट का मतलब होता है टोटल, ठीक है. टोटल, यू गाइज नो व्हाट टोटल मीन्स. और मार्केट का वर्ड कोई नया वर्ड नहीं है. दिस इज अ वर्ड दैट वी हैव ऑलरेडी स्टडीड इन माइक्रोइकोनॉमिक्स एज वेल. वी टॉक्ड अबाउट मार्केट एज बीइंग अ प्लेस वेयर बायर्स एंड सेलर्स इंटरैक्ट. सो मार्केट वाज कैप्चरिंग एंड स्टडीइंग द कंज्यूमर एंड द producer behavior. It was telling us that how consumers respond to price changes of a particular product in a particular market, and how producers respond to that, and how subsequently, if demand changes or supply changes, demand for this product changes, or demand for that product goes down or it goes up, and how the supply goes up and down, how would those demand and supply interchanging that are constantly changing, and how that interplay would result into subsequent changes in the prices of that product and the quantity being traded of that product. But वो हम बात कर रहे थे about the demand and supply of an individual market, जहाँ पे हमने किसी भी एक particular market की demand and supply of, let's say, good A, हमने पढ़ा था कि this is the price of good A, and this is the quantity of good A that is being traded. Subsequently, when demand goes up, the price goes up, or let's say the supply goes up, the price goes down, something like that. Along these lines हम ये पढ़ रहे. So technically we were studying about demand was reflecting consumer behavior, supply was reflecting producer behavior, and how consumers and producers interact and behave, and that subsequently has an impact on prices of that particular product in that particular market, and the quantity of that product in that particular market. So it could be the demand for pencils, or demand for chocolates, or demand for, I don't know, paper clips, or bicycles, or shirts, or anything, right? and so जब हमने डिमांड की बात की थी, डिमांड वाज रेफरिंग टू हाउ मच कंज्यूमर्स आर विलिंग एंड एबल टू पे फॉर अ पर्टिकुलर प्रोडक्ट, एंड द अमाउंट दे पे वाज टेक्निकली द अमाउंट दे स्पेंड. सो डिमांड वाज टेक्निकली द स्पेंडिंग ऑफ अ कंज्यूमर with respect to how much would they be spending with respect to at different price levels. So the amount of units that they would buy at different prices would technically reflect how much ultimately they are spending, right? Their expenditures basically. And while producers key supply was reflecting how much are they willing and able to produce, that is the production side. The supply of an individual producer was reflecting the production side of the producer in that particular market. So technically it was the spending side and the production side. And so when we said that demand and supply were equal, technically what we really meant was, when demand and supply were sort of equal, what we meant was that the spending side was equal to the production side in an individual market. अभी जानबूझ के मैं आपस में ये बार बार घुसा रहा हूँ इन चीज़ों को, because ultimately मुझे आपको कहीं और लेके जाना है, right? किसी और कॉन्सेप्ट पे लिंक करना है. So technically spending, हम इंडिविजुअल मार्केट्स में भी इक्विलिब्रियम अगर देखा जाए तो स्पेंडिंग को टेक्निकली, अब आप माइक्रो इकोनॉमिक्स में लिख के नहीं आ सकते कि स्पेंडिंग आउटपुट की इक्वल कर रहे थे, बट टेक्निकली इंट्यूटिवली मतलब वही बन रहा है कि कंज्यूमर्स आर डिमांडिंग समथिंग, टेक्निकली इट्स ऑल्सो हाउ मच दे वुड स्पेंड ऑन दैट. सो द मोर द प्राइस इज, द लेस दे वुड स्पेंड, बिकॉज द लेस दे वुड बाय, sort of. In that context, you can say that. So technically, and then the higher the prices, the more the producers would produce across the supply curve, representing an extension in supply. So technically, that was meaning more they would produce more. So spending and output was sort of, and at certain prices, spending and output was in disequilibrium, while at certain prices in a particular market they were in equilibrium. And how subsequent changes in demand and supply would represent subsequent changes in market prices and output, right? तो ये सब हम इंडिविजुअल मार्केट्स का पढ़ रहे थे. लेकिन अब हम मैक्रो इकोनॉमिक्स पढ़ रहे हैं, और मैक्रो इकोनॉमिक्स में हम एग्रीगेट इकोनॉमी देख रहे हैं, एग्रीगेट मार्केट यानी एग्रीगेट इकोनॉमी. व्हेन वी टॉक अबाउट मैक्रो इकोनॉमी, सो वी आर नॉट गोना टॉक अबाउट द डिमांड फॉर एन इंडिविजुअल प्रोडक्ट और द डिमांड फॉर चॉकलेट्स और डिमांड फॉर बाइसिकल्स. वी आर गोना बी टॉकिंग अबाउट द डिमांड फॉर everything by everyone, be it you. देखिए, even my school kid would want to buy something, right? So that's demand as well. Everyone demands in the economy, except for an infant who's just born right now. Other than that, everyone would go and buy something, right, who has money. So people demand goods and services, they pay for it, they're willing and able to pay a particular price for it, and so demand is just by everyone, right? So we're talking about demand. When we're talking about demand in the aggregate economy, we are actually referring to everything that is being demanded, from a pencil or a paper clip to something as big as a flying jet, right? Or a spaceship, or I don't know, right? So what we're saying is that demand for everything, of every product, by every industry, by everyone, and it could be an individual, it could be a firm, it could be maybe the government also buying something, maybe the government buying an office chair for its own office, right? So government is also, हमने पढ़ा है government consumption of goods and services में G के अंदर classify किया था expenditure method of GDP में about government consumption. So government is also a buyer, but government is also a buyer of final goods and services, right? तो हम एग्रीगेट इकोनॉमी की बात करते हैं, तो हम एग्रीगेट इकोनॉमी को एक इंडिविजुअल मार्केट से, आप ये समझेंगे एग्रीगेट इकोनॉमी वुड बी अ क्लस्टर और एग्रीगेट और टोटल ऑफ ऑल द मार्केट्स दैट एग्जिस्ट. सो द एग्रीगेट इकोनॉमी इज एन इकोनॉमी वाइड क्लस्टर है, समझ लें, ऑफ द डायनामिक फोर्सेज ऑफ ऑल द बायर्स एंड सेलर्स. डायनामिक फोर्सेज, डायनामिक क्यों बोल रहा हूँ, डायनामिक मतलब चेंजिंग, because individual markets में demand and supply was constantly changing. So dynamic forces of all the buyers and sellers, because buyers and sellers की जो forces हैं, forces मतलब कि what pushes and pulls them, right? Factors affecting demand and supply simply. So just like factors affecting demand and supply, there would be factors affecting total demand and total supply, and total demand or total supply would be aggregate demand and aggregate supply, because you're starting the aggregate economy right now. So these forces are constantly changing, which means that buyers and sellers of all the buyers and sellers in the economy, which could be the government as well, the firms as well, or maybe you also have foreign buyers in the form of exports, right? And so you have sellers of all the products. So you're talking about, when you're talking about the aggregate market, you're talking about the economy-wide cluster of the dynamic forces of all the buyers and sellers of all the products in the economy, of all the industries, be it primary sector, tertiary sector, secondary sector, for final use in the society. Here you're talking about the final goods and services in the society, right? So you're basically, when you're talking about the aggregate market, you're representing the entire economy's interactions. You're talking about the entire economy's interactions between the total demand for goods and services, which would be your aggregate demand, and the total supply of goods and services in the aggregate economy, which would be your total, which would be your aggregate supply, right? So ये चीज़ है कि what we are saying is that we are now referring to the aggregate economy, यानी हम अब basically aggregate economy पढ़ रहे हैं, that would represent the total demand of everything by everyone for every industry, and the total supply, total output of everything by everyone for every industry. And so we're going to be studying the interactions between the total demand and total supply, right? And इसका हमने एक बहुत ही basic version और एक बहुत ही इंडिविजुअल मार्केट वर्जन हमने डिमांड सप्लाई के चैप्टर में पढ़ा है. बट दैट इज नॉट व्हाट हाउ द मैक्रो इकोनॉमी वर्क्स. द मॉडल्स दैट वी स्टडीड इन माइक्रो इकोनॉमिक्स are different from the models that we will study in macroeconomics, right? So don't think that we're going to be studying about the law of demand or the law of supply. It's not that. या ये आपको अगर लग रहा हो कि हम लॉ ऑफ डिमांड बोलते थे या लॉ ऑफ एग्रीगेट डिमांड बोलेंगे, ऐसा कुछ नहीं है, राइट? सो दीज मॉडल्स आर डिफरेंट, बट कहने का रीज़न, उसको लिंक करने का यही है कि to so that you understand that हम इस वक्त aggregate economy पढ़ रहे हैं, right? And so I want to set your mindset in that उस mindset में उस zone में लाना चाह रहा हूँ मैं आपको, so that because you're starting macro now. I mean, we have started, but we're going to be slowly and gradually getting deeper into it, right? And I want to set the precedents and the base and the groundwork and the framework for you. I didn't start the lecture by just starting off with the definition of aggregate demand. That's not how I will go about it, right? So do remember that aggregate, anything that has to do with the demand side of an economy. When you talk about the demand side of an economy, we're going to be talking about the aggregate demand. Everything that has to do with the supply side of an economy, or everything that has to do with the aggregate supply, has to do with the supply side of the economy, or everything that has to do with the supply side of the economy is actually referring to aggregate supply. Right? So aggregate demand is the demand side of the economy, while aggregate supply is the supply side of the economy. It's very important to understand demand and supply. In fact, aggregate demand and aggregate supply in order to understand how your economy functions and understanding aggregate demand and aggregate supply is very important to us. Or in fact, that is the reason why we are studying the ADAS model, because understanding aggregate demand and aggregate supply would help us determine a model or a framework on the basis of which we can actually determine why there is inflation in the economy, or why economic growth is occurring, or why unemployment is occurring, because it would give us key insights on by studying the demand side, what influences the demand side of an economy, what influences the supply side of an economy, how can we make sure that how can we control that, and what significant implications would that have on output, and what implications would that have on price levels, in fact, and your GDP and your unemployment or growth, right? And you need to now understand that since we're talking about the aggregate economy, so output in an aggregate economy or in macro, when you're talking about output in macroeconomics, you're talking about everything. You're talking about GDP here, everything that is produced, right? So we're talking about GDP. So output is GDP, and when we talk about GDP, so we're talking about real GDP here, right? We're talking about real GDP, right? And so do remember that real GDP and national income, or real national income, are the same thing. So real GDP and real national income एक ही चीज है. They are the same thing, because it is income that determines. It is income that determines aggregate spending, right? And that spending in turn determines output, right? It's the income that will actually determine aggregate spending. The total income will be spent, that's the aggregate spending, and that spending in turn determines the output. But any level of output generates an equivalent level of income, right? So technically what you're saying is, so income, output, and spending must actually all be consistent, right? That is why we studied in the first few classes that national income equals national output equals national expenditure. So when we're talking about output here, we're referring to real GDP or real national income. And real GDP and real national income would be used interchangeably from now on, right? So when we are saying real GDP, we actually mean real national income, right? Now, guys, a couple of things that we already that we need to know basically when we're talking about the aggregate economy. The aggregate markets is basically the aggregate economy that we're talking about. So it's more. So a couple of things that we need to. So in the aggregate market, we already have discussed about the real GDP thing in the previous video as well. You're already aware what real GDP is, right? That is what real output is. And a couple of things that we need to also know is that, say, when we're discussing individual markets or demand and supply for individual product, we were discussing about the price of that individual product and how subsequent dynamic changes in demand and supply of that individual product could bring about changes in not only the output of that good that is traded, but also the prices of that good. But here, since we're talking about the aggregate economy, and since the aggregate economy is a cluster of all the buyers and sellers, and so it's talking about aggregate demand and aggregate supply in the economy. When we're talking about price, so instead of saying price, or instead of saying prices of a good, we're going to take the prices of every good. So guys, when we are talking about the prices of everything that is produced in the economy, right, we're talking about the price level of each and everything that is produced in the wider economy of all the goods and service. We're actually, so obviously, So what we are doing is that obviously we aren't going to take the price of each and every good. So we need to sort of, so what we are saying is when you're talking about the price level, we're taking a general price level, which means that we are saying that okay fine, what is the level of prices generally across the economy. So we're taking the average price of goods and services in the economy. अब जब हम इसको न्यूमेरिकली वैल्यू करते हैं, हम इसको इन्फ्लेशन के चैप्टर में देखेंगे कि हम इसको कैलकुलेट कैसे करते हैं. सो द प्राइस लेवल इज टिपिकली एक्सप्रेस्ड यूजिंग एन इंडेक्स नंबर, right? And you derive it from an index that is known as a consumer price index that sort of measures the changes in the price of a basket of goods and services that are commonly used by households. तो हाउसहोल्ड CPI आपका कंज्यूमर प्राइस इंडेक्स होता है जो कैलकुलेट करता है इन्फ्लेशन रेट को बेसिकली, और चेंजेस अगर CPI में जो चेंजेस आ रहे होते हैं ओवर द ईयर्स वो आपके इन्फ्लेशन रेट के चेंजेस बता रहा होता है. एंड सो इट टेक्स इनटू अकाउंट कि एक एवरेज पर्सन अपनी बास्केट ऑफ गुड्स में व्हाट sort of spending or what are the expenditures that an average person does in his basket of goods, how much he spends on utilities, on leisure, clothing, food, etc. And we're going to be seeing how that is actually calculated in the chapter of inflation, because that's not what we're doing right now. But जब हम price level की बात करते हैं in the macroeconomy, we're talking about the average price of goods and services generally across the economy. What is the general level of prices across the economy? Right? That is, we're referring to the average price of goods and services in the economy. So it captures the general prices of goods and services rather than the price of individual items. So price level itself क्या है? Price level simply level of prices in the economy, right? General price level in the economy, which is actually your CPI, Consumer Price Index. And Consumer Price Index is an index number, or it's a price index that is calculated because you want to measure what is the average prices in the economy. और average prices economy में क्या है, उसके लिए हमें देखना पड़ेगा कि लोग एक average person household किन किन चीज़ों पे expenditures करते हैं. Then we calculate that price index. And how do we do that? Again, like I said, अब inflation के chapter में पढ़ेंगे. But for now, what is price level? Price level is simply referring to the average price of goods and services in the economy, or it's simply the general prices of goods and services rather than the price of an individual item. So generally, मैं आपको बोलूँ कि price level is going up, it means there is more inflation in the economy. It means that generally the prices across the economy for different goods and services is going up, or the average price level is going up across for different goods and services in the economy. The price level is going down, it means that the general price level or the average price level is going down for different goods and services across the economy, right? Another thing that we need to understand is the word aggregate demand. Now, this word has been used previously as well. So, aggregate demand क्या है? It is the total demand, or you can say the right definition is that इसको आप एग्जाम में तो ये लिखेंगे, but just उसकी एक preliminary definition मैं आपको बताता हूँ. Aggregate demand is the total amount of real output, that is the amount of aggregate output that the consumers, firms, or the government and foreigners want to buy, or the demand at each possible price. ये definition मैंने इसलिए लिखी है because I wanted to link it with demand, and demand being in the aggregate economy, aggregate demand. That is a total amount of output that is demanded by consumers, firms, government and foreigners. They want to buy at each possible price. नहीं लिख कर आना, price level. At each possible, ये गलती identify, छोटी गलती नहीं है ये. At each possible price level over a particular time period. Because obviously you measure demand at a particular time period. So what is the level of aggregate demand in maybe quarter 1, quarter 2, or in year 1, year 2, right? So technically aggregate, like I said, since demand was sort of capturing spending by individual consumers also in microeconomics, simply aggregate demand is capturing spending. So aggregate demand is your total spending on an economy's goods and services. अगर aggregate demand total demand है for all the goods and services, so technically it is your total spending. Right, so aggregate demand is a spending side. When economists measure aggregate demand, they measure spending. If aggregate demand is the total amount of demand in the economy by consumers, firms, so how do we measure aggregate demand? By measuring the amount of expenditure done by these people. So aggregate demand is the total spending on the economy's goods and services at a given time period, at different price levels. ठीक है, इसी तरीके से कॉन्सेप्ट ऑफ एग्रीगेट सप्लाई क्या होता है अभी हम पढ़ेंगे, एग्रीगेट डिमांड का पूरा ग्राफ बना के आपको दिखाऊंगा, अभी हर चीज़ को समझेंगे हम, ठीक है. सो एग्रीगेट सप्लाई इज क्या है, एग्रीगेट सप्लाई इज बेसिकली, सो दैट्स द स्पेंडिंग साइड. एग्रीगेट डिमांड इज सॉर्ट ऑफ रिफ्लेक्टिंग और फैक्टरिंग इन और कैप्चरिंग द स्पेंडिंग साइड. But then we also have the output side. And the output side is how the firms or the production or how the industries are behaving across the economy. So aggregate supply is the total output or real GDP, the actual output that producers in an economy are willing and able to supply at a given price level in a given time period. ठीक है? So when you're talking about aggregate demand, you're looking at the spending side, where aggregate supply is talking about this output side of the economy. So it is aggregate supply is reflecting the total output that producers in an economy are willing and able to supply at a given price level at a given time period, right? So demand जो होती है, जब हम aggregate demand की बात करते हैं, because हमारा first topic would be aggregate demand and understanding about it, and so then we'll move on to aggregate supply. So when you talk about demand for an economy's product, which for all the products is your aggregate demand, and we know that demand is coming from households, firms, and the government within the country. But it's also coming from foreigners, from foreign residents, from foreign individuals, foreign firms and governments. और ये exports की शक्ल में होगी, right? So exporting to other countries, and that could be goods demanded by their governments or their firms or their households, right? So that is what basically aggregate demand is, and that is what aggregate supply, and then what price level is. Now we're going to be moving on to starting about or discussing more in detail about aggregate demand. But we'll be discussing about aggregate demand properly in the next video. What I would want to do is that I would want to quickly, just go through a concept, because this will build upon a lot of things in the later on videos. We talked about aggregate supply as being the total output or total GDP in the economy. Now, when we talk about total output, or what the firms in an economy is producing, when you talk about firms in an economy producing output, that is when you talk about aggregate supply, or when we talk about output, because aggregate supply simply captures output while aggregate demand captures your spending, right? When we talk about firms in an economy producing output, there are actually two ways to look at output, and I want you to understand this very carefully, because I'm going to be introducing this, but I'm going to be probably a few of you who have already studied economics before or in college might sort of understand what I'm trying to say over here. But when we actually do aggregate supply, we're going to be discussing that in more detail with the proper diagrams. But यहाँ पे I'm just going to be briefly touching upon a very few conceptual things, ताकि when I go through the diagrams of aggregate supply, over there you will understand it more fully in a more sort of holistic way. Now, when we talk about output, guys, there are two ways to look at output. एक होता है how much the economy can produce versus how much the economy is producing. So, for example, let's say let's say एक student है, तो एक student का जो output होगा would be the number of hours that he is actually studying. So your aggregate supply curve, let's say hypothetically speaking, would reflect how many hours you are studying, right? And so एक चीज होगी how many hours can you study versus how many hours you are actually studying. Similarly, so you might possibly end up studying less than what you can study, or you might end up studying more than what you can study. So what you can study is basically your potential number of hours, or your potential output that reflects the number of hours that you can study in a day. Now, the number of hours that you can study in a day has nothing to do with how much you're motivated to study, or less motivated or more motivated to study, because that's just your potential output. That's the number of hours that you can study in a day. Now, there could be a possibility that maybe you are very demotivated that day, so you might end up studying less number of hours. Or let's say you are highly motivated, you're pumped up, and you're like, you know what, I'm going to just study this chapter right there, and then I'm going to finish it. I'm going to study for, let's say, 10 hours, 12 hours a day. So when you have that, huge adrenaline rush going on inside you, so you decide that, you know what, I'm going to be studying more than what I, study, or I'm going to be studying more than what I can study, right? So I'm going to be studying more than my potential. So that is the actual output of you, your actual output, actual number of hours that you're, putting in. Similarly, economy का output भी potential और actual GDP में divided होता है. जब हम बात करते हैं what firms and an economy are able to produce, what they are able to produce, we are talking about, so we're looking at output in two ways: what economy is able to produce, or what firms and an economy are able to produce, versus what they are motivated to produce. जैसे कि हमने पढ़ा था, what you are, the number of hours that you are capable of studying, that was your potential output, versus how many hours are you motivated to study, right? That is your actual output. So, I mean, what firms and an economy are able to produce is reflecting the productive capacity of the economy, right? Now, firms and an economy could actually end up either producing more, or they could end up producing less than the productive capacity. Just like you can end up studying more or less than your productive capacity. So let's say if your capacity to study in a day is 10 hours, you could end up studying 6 hours a day, or you could even end up studying maybe let's say 13 hours a day. Now, always remember that when you're studying more than your productive capacity, it would obviously be putting a burden on you. ठीक है, वो हम आगे जाके हम देखेंगे. But obviously you will be burdenized because 10 hours is your sustainable capacity. So studying 13 hours a day is sort of unsustainable. It's going to put unsustainable pressure on you. It's going to put pressure on you. अब ये जो pressure on you बोल रहा हूँ ना मैं आपको, आपके ऊपर pressure आ रहा है. It's putting pressure on your sleep, head. I mean, you know, your body is in pain. There's physical, mental stress. और इसी तरीके से हम इसको we're going to be copy pasting this concept, and we're going to be applying this on the economy, that it puts pressure on the economy's resources when the economy tries to produce more than what its capacity is. Abhi isko baad mein dekhenge, but what we're saying is that the actual output could differ from the productive capacity, right? लेकिन productive capacity same रहती है आपकी. Productive capacity is not changing. Your actual output could be either be more or less than the productive capacity, or it could also be equal to the productive capacity, right? प्रोडक्टिव कैपेसिटी को इकोनॉमिक्स में रिमेंबर हम लॉन्ग रन रियल जीडीपी भी बोलते हैं, या हम इसको नेचुरल रियल जीडीपी भी बोलते हैं, या हम उसको पोटेंशियल जीडीपी भी बोलते हैं, या फुल एम्प्लॉयमेंट लेवल ऑफ जीडीपी भी बोलते हैं. आई एम प्रीटी श्योर दैट दोज पीपल हु आर स्टडिंग इन कॉलेज और माइट हैव स्टडीड आल्सो इकोनॉमिक्स एट IGCSE might probably have heard these things before as well, or you might have studied those diagrams in your classes at college where you might have seen the full employment level of GDP, right? But मेरा हमेशा ये है कि मैं डायग्राम बाद में आपको बताऊंगा, पहले उसका एक बेसिक कॉन्सेप्ट दूंगा, फिर हम डायग्राम के ऊपर आएंगे, ताकि डायग्राम पे फिर आपको खुद ही समझ में आना शुरू हो जाएगा, राइट? सो पोटेंशियल GDP is what the economy can produce, right? Do remember जब हम एग्रीगेट सप्लाई पढ़ेंगे, जैसा कि मैंने आपको पढ़ा, प्रोडक्टिव कैपेसिटी और पोटेंशियल जीडीपी इज बेसिकली अ लॉन्ग रन आउटपुट ऑफ इकोनॉमी. ये इकोनॉमी का लॉन्ग रन आउटपुट होता है. क्या होता है लॉन्ग रन आउटपुट? जब हम एग्रीगेट सप्लाई पढ़ेंगे तो देखेंगे. बट इज देयर एनी एग्रीगेट सप्लाई दैट is there any aggregate supply curve that captures this? Yes. So your potential GDP or your full employment level of GDP or your long run productive capacity is represented by the long run aggregate supply. इसको LRAS बोलते हैं इकोनॉमिक्स में, राइट? देखें, अभी हमने एग्रीगेट डिमांड एग्रीगेट सप्लाई का बेसिक कॉन्सेप्ट पढ़ा है. अब हम नेक्स्ट वीडियो ऑनवर्ड्स एग्रीगेट डिमांड के डायग्राम्स देखेंगे, फिर हम एग्रीगेट सप्लाई के कर्व्स देखेंगे, ठीक है? तो potential GDP is captured by a long run aggregate supply curve, and we'll study the long run aggregate supply curve once we are done with aggregate demand. Similarly, दूसरी चीज होती है what the producers are motivated to produce, that is what they're actually producing. And producers को motivation to produce more or less कहाँ से मिल रही होती है? Because of changes in the price level in the economy, right? Price level changes would have impacts on how much producers are willing and able to produce, right? How much they're motivated to produce, in fact, right? So how much the producers are motivated to produce, that is what the firms are actually producing, is represented by this actual GDP or actual output. And actual output may fluctuate, right? Actual output could be increasing or decreasing because of changes in various factors, because of changes in various, either the prices, either the price level in the economy might be going up and down, that could be potentially be causing changes in the real GDP, or there could be various other factors as well. वो हम देखेंगे जब हम एग्रीगेट सप्लाई पढ़ेंगे. So आपका जो एक्चुअल आउटपुट होता है उसको हम शॉर्ट रन रियल जीडीपी बोलते हैं. दिस इज कैप्चर्ड बाय द SRAS. SRAS स्टैंड्स फॉर शॉर्ट रन एग्रीगेट सप्लाई, राइट? Then do remember that your short run actual GDP or short run real GDP could be more or less than the potential GDP, right? And आपने ये वर्ड्स सुने होंगे अबाउट ग्रोथ आ रही है इकोनॉमी में, रिसेशंस आ रहे हैं इकोनॉमी में. सो जब हम करते हैं ना कि रिसेशन आता है तो आउटपुट गिर जाता है, ग्रोथ आती है तो आउटपुट बढ़ जाता है. ये कौन सा आउटपुट होता है? ये पोटेंशियल आउटपुट नहीं होता, ये एक्चुअल आउटपुट होता है. So fluctuations in your short run real GDP or actual output or your actual GDP causes changes in business cycles, the fluctuations in business cycles. And business cycles are those economic cycles of growth, of periods of booms and growth and recessions in the economy, where your actual output fluctuates, it goes up and down, right? So economy then witnesses periods of growth and recessions, right, guys? So, guys, to sum up, when we say about real GDP, we have to differentiate between real GDP that the economy is capable of producing versus the real GDP that is actually producing. So, the real GDP that the economy is capable of producing reflects the productive capacity of an economy, or the natural GDP, or the natural real GDP, or the full employment level of GDP, or the potential output that is captured by the long run aggregate supply curve of an economy. While the actual GDP, right, would constantly be fluctuating, going up and down due to changes, various changes in the economy, right? One of the changes that your actual real GDP would fluctuate up and down is due to changes in the price levels, while there are various other changes as well that you will study later on, right? So that is your actual real GDP. So that's it, guys, for this video. I hope you understood the concept, and I'll see you all around in the next video, where we are going to be starting out with aggregate demand.